Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be looking at something kind of different, something you might not expect.
Yeah, it's definitely a unique corner of history.
We're going to be talking about Ireland and more specifically Ireland's role in the British Atlantic world.
Not the typical story you hear about Ireland, right?
Right, exactly. And we're basing this deep dive on a review of a book called Ireland, Slavery and Anti-Slavery, 1612-1865. It's by Nini Rogers.
Great book. Really makes you rethink Ireland's place in the British Empire.
So to kick things off, what makes this book so special? What makes it stand out?
Well, for me, it's how it challenges that common perception of Ireland just being a victim of British rule, just be passively accepting their fate. It's a much more complex picture than that.
So you're saying the Irish were more than just subjects,
Yeah.
that they actually had an active role in shaping things?
Absolutely. Rogers makes a really compelling argument that Irish merchants and families were really active in the Atlantic economy. They weren't just sitting back. They built their own networks. They accumulated wealth.
Wow, so they were really making their mark. But hold on, wasn't this the time of British mercantilism? Didn't that make things difficult for the Irish?
Oh, for sure. The British definitely tried to control things. The whole point of mercantilism, remember, was to keep wealth and resources flowing within the empire. It put limits on colonies like Ireland.
Right, of course. So how did the Irish manage to do all this?
That's where the ingenuity comes in. They found these clever ways to work around those limits.
Loopholes, you mean?
Exactly. They focused on specific industries and trade routes, like take Cork, for example.
Yeah, I know Cork. Beautiful city.
Well, back then it became this major hub for provisions trade. They were supplying ships and colonies across the Atlantic.
Oh, wow, I never knew that. See, you learn something new every day.
And then you had Belfast, right, with its booming linen industry. It wasn't just limited to the big cities, though.
You're telling me there were smaller operations happening too?
All along the west coast of Ireland, you had these smaller regional trade networks popping up. It's really quite remarkable how diverse their economic activities were.
This is really changing my whole view of things. It wasn't just about surviving British rule. It was about actually thriving within that system.
Exactly. And that extends to their involvement in the transatlantic slave trade, too, which is a part of the story that's often overlooked.
Yeah, you typically hear about the Irish as indentured servants, but it sounds like there's more to it than that.
A lot more. Rogers highlights that they weren't just laborers. Irish merchants were actually building and running sugar plantations in the West Indies.
Really? So they were actually slave owners?
Yes, which of course is a very difficult and complex thing to grapple with, but it shows just how much economic power they had within the British Empire.
That's a really different perspective. Almost seems like they were mirroring what Scottish merchants were doing in the Atlantic world around the same time.
That's a great comparison. Both the Irish and the Scottish, they were part of the empire, but they were also forging their own paths. They weren't just following England's lead.
It's like they had this entrepreneurial spirit, finding their niche and building their own wealth. And, it seems like they used their unique cultural identity to their advantage as well.
Oh, absolutely. Just like the Scots, the Irish really leveraged their cultural background to build connections and make their way in the British Atlantic world.
That's fascinating.
What's interesting is that a lot of Irish merchants were Catholic, and they used those existing religious networks to their advantage.
So they had these connections with other Catholic communities.
Exactly. Places like France, Spain, Portugal. These became valuable networks, giving them opportunities outside the traditional British system.
So they were really working both sides of the coin.
You could say that.
Oh.
It allowed them to operate on multiple levels, both within and beyond British control. Which brings us to this idea of incomplete British ascendancy.
Right. That's something Rogers mentions in the book, this concept that British control over Ireland wasn't actually absolute.
It's a key argument she makes, and we're going to explore that more as we go deeper into this topic. But for now, just think about it this way. The Irish, through their economic activities and cultural connections, they were able to carve out their own space within the British Empire.
Yeah. And they showed a level of autonomy that often gets overlooked.
Exactly. It's a story that deserves to be told. But this idea of incomplete British ascendancy, it wasn't just about economics.
Oh, so there's more to it.
Oh, yeah, it really played out in the realm of ideas, like social movements.
Gotcha. So how does that tie back to Ireland's role in the British Atlantic?
Well, think about it. Ireland was right in the middle of this whole transatlantic slave trade thing.
Right, right. We were talking about that earlier.
And at the same time, you had these anti-slavery movements starting to gain traction.
And Rogers connects these two things.
That's what's so fascinating about her work.
Yeah.
She shows how those economic realities we were talking about, they actually helped fuel the rise of anti-slavery sentiment in Ireland.
Huh. So Irish merchants were involved in the slave trade, but there was also this growing opposition to it. That seems kind of contradictory, right?
It is. It's one of the big tensions that Rogers explores.
How does she explain that? I mean, how could those two things coexist?
Well, she argues that as Ireland's own social and political scene was changing, so was its relationship with slavery. Remember, Ireland was under British rule, experiencing its own forms of exploitation.
So they saw what was happening in the colonies and were like, hey, this isn't right.
Exactly. It's like their own experience with oppression opened their eyes to the injustices happening elsewhere.
That makes a lot of sense. So it wasn't just some abstract moral argument, it was personal.
It was deeply personal. Their anti-slavery movement was fueled by real lived experiences both at home and in the colonies.
That makes me wonder, how did their movement compare to the one in Britain? Were they working together, or was it a completely separate thing?
That's a great question, and Rogers gets into that too. She really emphasizes the unique flavor of the Irish anti-slavery movement.
Like it had its own distinct character.
Exactly. Because remember, their relationship with Britain was unique. They had their own internal dynamics going on as well.
So were there specific things driving the Irish movement other than the moral arguments?
Absolutely. You have to think about the long tradition of social justice activism within Irish Catholicism.
Makes sense, yeah.
And then you had this widespread resentment towards British rule, which was seen as inherently oppressive.
Right, of course.
So all of that combined created this powerful force, this energy that pushed them to challenge the system that was profiting from slavery.
Wow, this is so much more layered than I ever realized.
It is, isn't it? It's not just about economics. It's about identity, resistance. It's about challenging the very core of the empire.
It's almost like she's saying, look closer, there's more to this story than you think.
That's a great way to put it. Her work is really about uncovering those hidden layers and forcing us to confront the complexities of history.
I'm really starting to see how this all ties back to that idea of incomplete British ascendancy.
Yeah.
It's like this anti-slavery sentiment was another way the Irish were pushing back against British control.
That's a really insightful connection. You could definitely interpret it that way, as a form of resistance, where they asserted their own moral values and challenged the legitimacy of what the empire was doing.
So what were some of the things that stood out to you from the book? What really grabbed your attention?
Well, one thing that really struck me was how detailed she gets about how Irish merchants and families navigated the slave trade.
Like the nitty-gritty details.
Exactly. It's not just this simple idea of buying and selling people. She goes into the financing, the insurance, the provisioning, the whole web that made the system work.
So it shows just how deeply involved they were in all aspects of it.
Yes, and she doesn't sugarcoat it either. She really confronts the reader with the brutality of the system, the human cost of it all.
That must be a tough thing to read about.
It is. But it's also important, she doesn't let us forget about the people who are suffering. But she also balances that with the hope that the anti-slavery movement represents.
So she captures both sides of it, the complicity and the resistance.
Exactly. It's a fascinating human drama playing out against this larger historical backdrop. And it's a story that still resonates with us today as we deal with the legacies of colonialism and slavery.
That's so true. It's not just ancient history.
It's still shaping our world in ways we might not even realize.
You know, it's amazing how just looking at this one book review has opened up like a whole new understanding of Irish history. It makes you think how much we're missing by ignoring these kind of interconnected stories.
Yeah, for sure. It's like history isn't just a bunch of random events. It's more like a tapestry. Right?
Okay, yeah, I get that.
You have all these different threads woven together, and each one, even the small ones, they all contribute to the bigger picture.
And sometimes by looking at just one thread, you can get a whole new perspective on the entire tapestry.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to explore those overlooked parts of history. It helps us challenge our assumptions and see things in a new light.
Okay, so speaking of seeing things in a new light, I want to circle back to that idea of incomplete British ascendancy that we talked about before.
Yeah, that's a big one. It's really at the heart of Rogers' argument.
So she's basically saying British control over Ireland wasn't as total as we might think.
Right. She argues that there were always pockets of resistance, some obvious and some more subtle, that kind of chipped away at that dominance.
It makes me think about Irish culture, how it survived for so long under British rule.
Absolutely. Things like Catholicism, the Irish language, their music, those are all powerful examples of how the Irish held on to their identity.
They didn't just assimilate, they found ways to resist and adapt.
Exactly. They kept their heritage alive.
It's almost like they were playing this double game, outwardly conforming but inwardly preserving their own traditions.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. And Rogers goes even deeper by looking at how this played out on an individual level.
What do you mean?
She looks at how families made decisions about things like marriage or education or religious practice.
So like everyday life stuff.
Yeah. They were finding ways to assert their autonomy within a system that was trying to control them.
So it wasn't just about big rebellions or political movements. It was also about those small, personal acts of defiance.
Exactly. All those little choices, they add up. They create this really powerful tapestry of resistance.
It's kind of inspiring, isn't it? Even in a system of oppression, people still found ways to challenge it.
It is. And it's a message that's still relevant today. There's still so much injustice in the world.
So Rogers is saying we shouldn't be afraid to resist.
In whatever way we can. We all have the power to make a difference.
Wow, this has been a really eye-opening conversation. I feel like I've learned so much about Ireland's role in the British Atlantic world. It's so much more complex than I ever imagined.
It's been great talking about it.
So for our listeners who want to learn more, where should they start?
Well, first off, definitely check out Rogers' book, Ireland, Slavery and Anti-Slavery, 1612–1865. It's a great read.
Definitely adding that to my list. What else?
Oh, there's tons of stuff out there. Libraries and archives are full of primary sources from that period. And there are lots of great books and articles by historians who are experts on this topic.
So much to explore.
Yeah. Just be curious and keep digging. You never know what you might find.
That's great advice. Well, I think that about wraps up our deep dive for today. But before we go, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about.
Okay, shoot.
What if we all tried to look at history in a more nuanced way? Embracing the complexities and challenging those simple narratives we've been taught.
That's a great question. It would definitely change how we see the world.
It would make us question our assumptions and really dig deeper into the past.
Exactly. We
Yeah.
might even learn something about ourselves in the process.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So to all our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and never stop learning. Until next time, happy exploring.